You guys have suffered through suffering. Congratulations. I'm quite impressed with all of you. It's been a long day and a heavy day. You know, whenever you deal with this topic, it's not necessarily something that makes you necessarily feel good or great, you know? There's some questions that we could do conferences on that you're going to walk away feeling like, this is amazing, I feel so rich, I feel like I could conquer the world, like you just feel like you got like some superpower or something, you know? Conferences like this on the topic of suffering almost leave you feeling quite contemplative, thinking about life, processing through, trying to understand still, trying to decipher still. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to let it sit. I think it's okay to simmer in the discomfort as we continue to think through and process through this whole topic. And I know for many people, when we think of this whole topic of suffering, it's one of those things where it's kind of like, how do I even believe in a God that allows this? And I know we've kind of talked a lot today about different ways in which we can feel confident in terms of maybe there isn't a contradiction between Christianity and suffering and evil and this kind of thing. Sometimes it may still make us not want to believe. Or sometimes we may still feel frustrated, or we might still feel angry. And it can just lead us to wonder, why should I believe in a God in a world in which there's evil and suffering? But when we say we don't want to believe, friends, where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place where essentially we're saying, I will only believe in something if I like it. I only believe in something if it says the things I want it to say. I was chatting with a friend of mine who was an atheist several years ago, and I said to her, has there ever been a point in your life where you wish there was a God? She said, absolutely. But the God that I want to exist doesn't exist. And so for her, I'll believe if the God that I want is there. But is that really the approach that we have to take? Or should the approach actually be what truly is there? What is truth? What actually is out there? And if that's the approach that we take, this idea of truth, well, then maybe there is something that we can consider. Because the reality is, there's only two options, friends. Either there's a God or gods, or there's not. That's it. Either there's a God or gods, or there's not. There's only two options. And believe it or not, his existence is not contingent upon whether or not we want him to be there. His existence is not contingent upon whether or not we like him. His existence isn't contingent upon whether or not we have all the answers. Either he's there or he's not. And so truth matters. And that ultimately is what we have to begin to seek. And do the best to answer and understand and sort through so many of the things that come into play if there really is a God. But ultimately, don't you want to know what's true? Now, I know that in speaking with an audience like this, there's people from a variety of different backgrounds, and for some people, they say, look, I've considered Christianity, but honestly, I don't really have a good feeling about Christianity because I've experienced maybe Christians, or I've experienced people that maybe have hurt me that are Christians, or I've been hurt by the church, and so this whole Christianity thing is I'm just kind of distant from it. And if for the Christians out there, you need to hear that. You need to hear, it's actually one of the more popular questions I'm starting to get now, is if God is really real, and if he's really good, then why don't Christians live like it? Brennan Manning once said, the greatest single cause of atheism today are Christians who acknowledge he is with their lips and then walk out the door and deny him with their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And so maybe there is things that, not maybe, there's definitely things that Christians need to apologize for. But what we never want to do is say, I won't believe because of what somebody else does. Christians aren't perfect. They're pointing to someone who is. In fact, the very reason they're a Christian is because they recognize that they are imperfect and they need somebody to help them with themselves. To save them is the actual word that Christians will use, that will help reunite them, something to help reunite them back with their perfect God and Creator. And that's where Jesus comes to play within Christianity. So for the Christian, you're not looking for them to live perfectly, but you are watching the way that they act when they mess up. You're watching their attitude. They're I'm sorry, they're forgive me, like I'm trying again. That's what you're looking for. But you never want to let somebody else's life be the excuse for you. At some point, you have to decide, does truth matter? Now, you're probably like, really, Alycia? You came all the way from America to tell me that? Believe in Christianity because you think it's true? Well, I want to give you a little bit more today. I want to give you some reasons that I think maybe some, it's not comprehensive, but just some good reasons that I think should help propel us towards belief. And I often hear people say to me, but you know what, if there really was no God, if religion was eradicated, then the world would be a better place. Because religion is really the one that's causing harm. So if we could just get rid of religion, we'd be fine. We'd be great, and everything would be good. So I think that's an interesting kind of mindset, the idea that the only reason why we're dealing with horrific things in this world is because there's a God or because there's religion. But this is an interesting question for us to reflect on. Don't we all have the ability to do good and evil? Don't we all struggle to know good or evil? Don't we all struggle to do right or wrong? Can we do good? Well, Dr. Jesse Bering is an experimental psychologist, and he specializes in evolutionary psychology and human behavior. He would consider himself an agnostic. He was an atheist, but he would consider himself an agnostic because when his mother was dying, there was some kind of supernatural experience, he says, that led him from atheism to agnosticism. So he's not a religious person. Well, several years ago, Dr. Bering conducted an experiment on kids, ages 5 and 6 and 8 and 9. And he had them walk up to a dartboard like this, and we gave them little felt balls or something like that, and he says, okay, this is what I want you to do. Here's the dartboard, and you see this line? I want you to turn your back to the dartboard. I want you to throw with your weak hand, not your dominant hand, throw the balls onto the dartboard. And whoever gets the most on the dartboard or gets the highest points or whatever gets a prize. So, of course, these are little kids, and they're like, ooh, that's exciting, do anything for a candy bar, So he leaves the room and leaves one kid in there at a time, but he doesn't tell the kids that there's a hidden camera. So he goes into another room, and he watches to see what's going to happen. Well, probably not much to your surprise. Once he leaves, the kids are like, okay. So they do a couple, and they realize, well, this is actually much harder than I thought it was going to be. And there's nobody here. So they would just run up and maybe put their little ball on the dartboard and run back. One little girl actually ran to the door, opened it to see if anybody was looking, shut the door, runs up, and put their thing up. And you're laughing because you're on the other side of the camera, and you're like, they're 5, they're cute, right? And so Dr. Jesse Bering actually says, why not cheat if no one is watching? Makes sense to the kids. So then he runs this experiment a second time. This time he introduces adults into the room and leaves the adults in there while the kid is throwing. And then he runs the experiment a third time, and the third time he introduces Princess Alice. Now, Princess Alice has special powers, he tells the kids. So different batch of kids. Princess Alice has the ability to be invisible. He's like, and so she is sitting in this chair right next to the dartboard. So you can't see her, she's sitting right there. And of course the kids are like, oh, wow, invisible person in the room. They're just really excited about all this. So of course he leaves the kid in there. And what do you think that they find? After doing this experiment with hundreds of kids, Dr. Bering finds that when adults or Princess Alice is in the room, kids were significantly less likely to cheat. The adults in Princess Alice were essentially fitting the role of what any supernatural being is believed to do in society. She's watching them. She cares about their behavior, and she'll probably act if they misbehave. So what is Dr. Jesse saying then with these comments? He says this is an all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful interventionist, moralistic deity. That help steer people in direction of good behavior. If you don't believe him, ask yourself, would you lie to your family members or your friends if you knew that they could never find out that it was a lie? How many of you would speed down the road if you knew no police officer would catch you? How many of you would embezzle $5 million if you knew you were never going to get caught? Now, am I saying that the only way to be good is to believe in God? No, absolutely not. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's true. I know plenty of people who do good things who are not Christians or who don't believe in any God at all. Okay? So I think it's really wrong for somebody to say, well, only religious people can do good things. That's not fair. I think they can do many good things, but my question isn't really that. My point isn't really, can you do good things without God? My question is, how much bad do you do because you think no one is watching? Who are you when no one else is around? When you lose the Princess Alice figure in your life, do you still make the right decisions? Why should you? When we say the world would be a better place if we were to eradicate religion, I think that makes sense if we eradicate the wrong religions. But if there is something to Christianity, and there is something to humankind, then who would we then be if we eradicated something good and positive as a society? I think Dr. Jesse's findings show us one of the reasons we need to not just believe in a God, but believe in the right God. You can still believe in God or believe in the wrong thing, I would say. But believe in the right God. Without this being, we aren't as good as we think. And I think his findings are pretty hard to argue with. And this is actually one of the things that I really love about Christianity. Because it's not just, hey, you need to do good things because God says it. Because what does that mean? That just means he could have said one day, hey, this is good, and then next year he could say, well, now this thing is good. That becomes good and bad become arbitrary because whatever God feels like saying on a particular day or year or time period. And it also doesn't just say that God is telling you to do good things or bad things because these things are things that exist and God is somehow trying to enlighten you as to what good and bad is, but he also is subject to them. What Christianity actually says is something isn't good or bad just because God says it. But something is good or bad, good because it's grounded within the very nature or character of a good being. See, the idea being is that if God truly is God, then he's got to be the highest, most conceivable, all knowledgeable, all perfect being ever that we could ever think. And if you can think of anything greater than that thing is God, not this. So his nature, his essence has to be good too. And so Christianity grounds morality within his very character so that you know you're getting a good command from something that actually is perfectly good. So mercy is good because God is merciful, and forgiveness is good because God is forgiving, and love is good because God is love itself. He's the essence of the good things. So you don't need to question, you don't need to wonder, you don't need to know whether or not something really is good or bad because you can actually trust the source that it's coming from. But I also hear people say to me, you know what? I just don't believe because there's not enough evidence. I hear this all the time. It's probably one of the most popular things that I hear. There just isn't enough evidence for Christianity. And I think that's really interesting. And I would concede that to a certain extent. I think that there is definitely certain stories in the Bible that we don't have evidence for, per se. I think that's fair. The Bible has a lot of stories and talks about a lot of people. But we do have evidence for the actual text, the actual Bible itself. The thousands of Bible fragments and pages that we have, the authorship of the New Testament, knowing that the authors were people that were either disciples of Jesus or friends of disciples of Jesus, the one exception being Hebrews, because its authorship is still up for a little bit of question there. But still, we have close first-hand sources or second-hand sources when it comes to the life of Jesus and the life of his disciples afterwards. We have plenty of evidence for the resurrection. And what I find is I can give you a lot of evidence for all kinds of things. But do you really need it? Do you really need evidence to believe in something? If I was to say to one of you in this room, prove to me that your mother is your mother, what might you say? Well, I have pictures of her. I look like her. I have memories of her. She's cooked me certain meals. She's taken me to certain appointments, whatever it might be. But have any of you ever given her a DNA test? How many people would look at you and say, you're an idiot for thinking that's your mother? You haven't tested her yet. Nobody would say that to you, right? In other words, guys, there's things that we can believe in this world, even if we don't have conclusive proof for it. Having physical evidence isn't the only way to believe in something. Or what if you had a horrible headache? And you go to the doctor's office, you're like, look, I just have the worst headache, and I just can't seem to get rid of it. And they're like, hey, relax, don't worry. I got something for you. I have a particular drug that you can take that in 2009 alone, 27 billion doses were sold. I'm like, well, that's pretty good. Yeah, and this drug has been around over the counter for over 50 years, so there's billions and billions and billions of people who have taken this drug. Oh, well, that's pretty convincing. You're feeling pretty good about this. He says, but I got to let you know, there is some danger to your liver as a result of this drug, so you got to, don't abuse it and, use it prolonged and this kind of thing. You're like, okay, well, it's billions of people have used it, and they seem to be okay, and, well, give it to me. Then the doctor looks at you and says, okay, but actually there's one more thing I got to tell you. See, we're actually not really sure how this drug works. There's different theories in the medical community, but there really isn't a big, massive consensus as to how this drug works. And so while we don't know fully what it actually does in your body and how it changes things in your body and what it's actually affecting, what we do know is that it works. Do you take it? The ironic thing, friends, is I'm actually not making this up. This is actually a real drug that probably most of you, if not all of you, in this room have taken. In the UK, it's called paracetamol. In the US, it's called Tylenol or acetaminophen. It's also called the Enigma pill, because the medical community is just not sure how in the world this works in your body. We have different ideas, and there's different theories, and there's different possibilities, but there's no consensus because they haven't been able to fully figure it out yet. So are you an idiot for taking it, even though you don't have full-on proof or physical evidence as to how it works? No. We don't need conclusive proof for absolutely everything. The absence of answers doesn't negate its legitimacy. There's certain things in life that we can understand through words and through evidence, but many, and perhaps the most significant, we understand not through words but through experience. And we know that this drug has worked for many, many people, potentially even for you. So next time you have a headache, you might go and grab a Tylenol. I was doing a dialogue with an atheist actually in Montreal in January, and he said to me, he's like, even if I became a Christian, even if I did believe in God, the idea that I'd want to worship him makes no sense to me. And I was like, well, that's fair, right? I mean, I granted him his point because all I'm doing is sitting there on the stage describing and talking about God. But that's only so much. That's only moving the argument but so far. And so I can understand why he would say the idea of worshiping something is inconceivable to me. There's only certain things that make sense on the inside. Once you've gone from one place to the next, there's only certain things that make sense maybe when you're willing to be open or when you're willing to try. There's only so much you can understand from the outside looking in. Imagine I was speaking to a molecular scientist who was fascinated with the inner workings of a cell, and me being an apologist and a criminal justice major and a social justice major didn't understand any of this. So he goes on, he talks about how cool the mitochondria is, and he talks about ribosomes and the smooth and rough endoplasmic reticulum and blah, 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 and I'm like, whatever, I just don't really care. So he sees this board. He's like, okay, hold on a second. He grabs this really high-tech microscope, and he says, look in here. So I look in the microscope. He lets me look into it. And he then begins to describe what I'm seeing and what each part does. And then I begin to see the parts of the inside of the cell move and function. And I begin to become intrigued. So intrigued that I start to become curious, and I begin to ask, why is this thing doing this? Or why is this thing doing this? And then all of a sudden, I gasp. And I get it. I see the cell, or I see one of those little tiny parts move in a way that just blows me away. And all of a sudden, I'm like, wow, this thing is actually amazing. And the scientist friend of mine sits back and says, really nothing. He just smiles and looks at me, and he watches as I go from just a short amount of time, as I go from disinterest to wonder. Not because he had said anything or done anything profound, but because I was willing to enter into the experience. What taught me was my own personal experience and not his. You may have experienced this when you talk with a friend of yours, and maybe some really funny story happened, 2 months ago, and you're with another friend, you're like, let me tell you about what happened. And you're sharing the story with a friend, and they're trying to track with you, and you get to the punchline, and you're like dying, crying, and they're just looking at you. And so what do you say? Like, oh, you just had to be there, right? You just had to be there because clearly it's not funny. But what are you saying? You're saying essentially, in order for you to get what I'm saying, you had to be part of the experience. The words can't fully convey this to you. The words can't fully communicate to you how funny this is. You just had to be there. And I think this is what I think this is what Christianity asks us to do. There's only so much that you can experience being on the outside, just sitting there getting questions answered. You've got to be willing to step in and see what actually happens on the inside. You've got to be willing to try. In child psychology, there's this term called object permanence. And it's actually quite interesting. It talks about this idea that children construct their knowledge or ideas of the world based on what they perceive, like see, smell, touch, etc., and experience. So they construct their knowledge and ideas of the world based on what they perceive and experience. In other words, if they can't see it, it doesn't exist. So from 0 to 4 months, a child has absolutely no idea that what they can't see is even real. Which is why when you do this peekaboo game, and you're like, this is so silly, but they're dying laughing. They think it's so exciting. Because every time you go like this, they think your eyes are gone. They think your eyes appear. They think your eyes are gone. They think your eyes appear. They don't understand that your eyes are still there. They have no idea of a permanence of an object that they can't see, smell, touch, feel. But from 4 to 8 months, they begin to reach for objects that are partially hidden. I can only see a part of it, and part of it's hidden, but maybe all of it's there. And from 8 to 12 months, they begin to look for an object where they last saw it hidden. So maybe you've done the game, you have like a little toy bear, and you bring it out in front of you, and they laugh and put it behind your back. What do they start to do? They start to go look for it behind your back. So although they can't see it, they start to realize the last place I saw it go was here, so maybe it's still there. And then from 12 to 18 months, they're able to find a hidden object, retrieve it, and then that's rehidden. But by the time they're a year and a half, 18 months and up, they're able to recognize the permanence of objects that exist independent of their perceptions and actions. They learn to believe that there are things that are there that are beyond what they can physically see, touch, and experience on their own. That what their tiny world is showing them isn't all that there is. But what I see is that people become adults. And they say to me, Alycia, there isn't enough conclusive proof, so I won't believe or consider that there's something there that I cannot see, touch, or feel. And we reverse something we learned basic as a child. We shut ourselves off to the possibility that there's something that we can experience that is beyond us. So what was it that made that child even consider anything in the first place? Was it because mom said, you have to do this? No, they're still trying to understand language at those young ages. Did the child consider looking because they were afraid of being disciplined? No, not really, because usually these are games. These are fun things. There's laughter involved. What is it that made The child willing to consider and discover something that doesn't exist when they can't see it, they were willing to look. G.K. Chesterton once said, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." Words penned nearly 90 years ago that sound like they were written just this morning. The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. You've got to be willing to look. Look at how different and how dangerous the world will be without a God holding us morally responsible. You've got to be willing to look at what the evidence is telling you. You've got to be willing to look at the fact that there is enough there to believe, even if we don't have 100% conclusive proof. Why should you believe? Because maybe everything around us is pointing towards belief. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is out of Job. You guys are getting the idea that I really love Job, yes. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. But Job chapter 12 says, "But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, or the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and the fish of the sea will explain to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, in whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind?" In whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. Why would God want us to know that? Because maybe he wants us to know how important we are to him. Maybe he wants us to know the depth of his love for every one of us. Maybe he wants us to know that he's actually much closer than we think he is. And in fact, if you go way back into the beginning of the Bible, it talks about how God was in the garden with Adam and Eve, walking in the cool of the day. It gives us a good framework to understand the point of creation. Creation was, the point of him creating us was not because he was bored or needed something to do. It wasn't because he was lacking in anything. It wasn't because he wished that he could love somebody. He was already loving. He was already in relationship. He was already fully complete and perfect in and of himself. But out of creating, he now allows for the possibility of us to be brought into that perfect love, into that relationship, into those experiences with a God who values every one of his creation. And so Christianity teaches that relationship, that closeness with God, is ultimately what you were created for. But like we talked about earlier, we all wrestle with right and wrong, and we don't always do things right at the time. I mean, I know you probably, think, Alycia, boy, she is just the coolest person I've ever met from America. I know you're thinking that about me. But guess what, guys? Sorry to ruin it for you, but I've messed up. I have regrets in life. I look back and I've got moments of shame, and I'm like, shame on you, Alycia, or you should have done this, or man, I wish I could have done this differently, or whatever. But the reality is these moments of shame and failure actually aren't just our own, but they also sever. They also break our relationship with God. And so what is the God to do? He can't just, we talked about justice earlier, he can't just ignore things, because then he's not just. If you go to court and a judge ignores a crime, we wouldn't say he's just. But he can't just extend forgiveness and mercy to us all, because he wouldn't be just either. And he can't just be all judging and just giving you penalty after penalty after penalty, because then where does the mercy and grace fall in? And if God is perfect, he's got to be perfect in every attribute, every character piece. And so for the Christian, the cross is a merge of these two beautiful things. It's justice and it's God extending mercy. Punishment for what we've done wrong, but mercy extended to all of humanity, that we don't have to suffer and pay the full penalty of what we've done wrong, because he's laid it out on himself. A God who wants to be close, a God who says, if you're willing to look. Acts 17 says, God determined the time set for us in the exact place where we would live, and he did this so that men would seek him, reach out for him, and find him, because he's not far from each one of us. God who desires relationship and closeness with his creation. But some of you may say, well, Lisa, you may be bad, but you know what? I'm actually not really all that bad. I'm actually a pretty good person, so I think I'm going to be okay to get to heaven. And I always find it interesting when people say that to me, because my question is, okay, well, how many good deeds do you need to do to get to heaven then? Tell me so I can do them. Like, what's the number? Is it 20,000? 20,000 good deeds over the course of my life? Well, if that's the case, then doesn't it really stink for the person who died only doing 19,999 good deeds? Oops, they missed it. Or some people may say, you know what? The big guy and I are really cool. We're on good terms. How do you know that? Who told you that? Or maybe you're a person who has a story like mine who carries shame because you haven't lived the good life, and you were hoping that maybe somebody could love you even if they knew your past. Well, God knows just how to deal with shame. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once said, "It is good to be tired and weary from fruitlessly seeking the true good, so that one can stretch out one's arms to the Redeemer." The Christian message is a good one. Doesn't mean you should believe in it just because it's a good one, but it's just nice to know that believing in that what is true is good. But we should believe, because I think it is in that direction that all of life points. I love what Philip Yancey says. He says, "I sense in romantic love something insufficiently explained by mere biochemical attraction. I sense in beauty and in nature marks of a genius creator for which the natural response is worship. I sense in desire, including sexual desire, marks of a holy yearning for connection. I sense in pain and suffering a terrible disruption that omnipotent love surely cannot abide forever. I sense in compassion, generosity, justice, and forgiveness a quality of grace that speaks to me of another world. I sense in Jesus a person who lived those qualities so consistently that the world could not tolerate and had to silence and dispose of him. In short, I believe, not so much because the invisible world impinges on this one, but because the visible world hints in the ways that move me most at a lack of completion. It's as if the visible world has signs of the invisible all over it." Many of you are probably familiar with a gentleman named Thomas. He was a follower of Jesus, saw him do a lot of miracles. But I think Thomas is somewhat like us, in the sense that Thomas really struggled to actually believe whether or not this whole thing was true. After Jesus died, he rose from the dead, and he appears to women and he appears to his followers, but not all the followers, not all the disciples were there in the room when he appeared to them. One of the people that was not there was Thomas. So Jesus appears to these disciples, and they begin to, and when Thomas comes back in, they tell Thomas, "Guess what? We see Jesus." And Thomas is like, you're not going to get me that easy. "Until I see the nail prints in his hands and the scars in his hands and his side, I will not believe." So what's interesting about that is Jesus gave him the opportunity. And I want to go ahead and read you a little bit of this story. "Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the nail marks in his hand and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.' A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' Then he said to Thomas, 'Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Now stop doubting and believe.' Thomas said to him, 'My Lord and my God.'" What's interesting about this is Jesus didn't just come in and say, "Thomas, you fool, believe because we say it's true. Believe because I told you things." Jesus says, "Thomas, you want evidence? I'm going to give it to you. And now that I've given you the evidence, now stop doubting and believe." Christianity was always a belief system based on evidence. It was never something that was supposed to be followed blindly. It was never supposed to be something that people just said, "Oh yeah, this sounds cute, I'm just going to follow it." Jesus gave evidence that what he said, that what he said about himself and who he said he was actually true. And he did it through the healings and the miracles, but ultimately through his own resurrection. And what's interesting is Thomas was a man probably similar to a lot of people today that said, I want evidence. And Jesus says, I'll give it to you. And I've traveled to India twice now. And on one of those trips, I've had the opportunity to go to what's believed to be Thomas's grave. Can't be conclusively proven. But as the story goes, 20-some-odd years after Jesus' resurrection, Thomas goes all the way to India and shares with them the story of Jesus. And so if you were to go there, there are people, Indian Christians, who trace their lineage back to being the descendants of the church that Thomas started there. And when you go to his tomb, on his tomb are written 5 simple words: my Lord and my God. A man who was willing to consider the evidence laid before him, who was willing to say, what is it that you ultimately have for me, God? We talked about a bunch of different things today. We talked about suffering, we talked about pain, we talked about trafficking, abuse. I mean, between yesterday and today, there's been a lot of things that have really touched us in so many different ways. And while all of these things are really challenging for us to process through, the alternative isn't really that encouraging. Pain and suffering is going to exist, even if Christianity wasn't true. If we were to prove tomorrow that Jesus actually never rose from the dead and say Christianity isn't true, guess what? The pain and suffering doesn't go away. Once again, like I said earlier, the questions are still there. All that changes is now how we answer them. And so we would just have to come up for another answer or another way to deal with the pain and suffering in this world. But Christianity offers us hope. It offers us a redemption, a way for broken, sad, hurting people to be reunited with a perfectly good, loving Creator. And for some of you, maybe that's the first time you've heard that. Maybe that's the first time that you've experienced that. But let me encourage you, don't leave here today in that same state. There's plenty of people here who would love to talk with you, explain some more things about Christianity to you. You're welcome to come to me, any one of the speakers, any one of the people that's probably in the first row. You could grab, I'm assuming everybody in the first row is on the planning team, but you could grab any of them. Talk to somebody. Because I think that you will find that the Christian message isn't just true, it isn't just good, it actually changes the way in which we live our lives in a good way and an exciting way, and gives us the best answers for what we've been looking for. Thank you guys so much.